So this chapter is on social interaction, and it's super important. One of the things you'll notice in this chapter is that the authors cite lots of research, and some of the studies are pretty interesting, and some of them aren't. Some of them are classics in the field of psychology and sociology. So the big questions that will be on the next quiz include: how do we develop a sense of self? How do we make sense of ourselves? Sounds pretty similar to the first question. Who matters to us? What challenges do we face as we move from one context to another? So how do we develop a sense of self? Depends who you ask. George Herbert Mead, probably one of the most famous American, sociologists, was a social interactionist. And he believed that we do that through an evolving sense of interaction with other people. In his case, he believed that children started this process through play, and we develop our sense of self throughout our lifespan, from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, and even into old age. So think about self as a process more than a thing. And of course, this all happens through the process of communication with other people. Markets, organizations, and work in the 21st century have changed substantially. And of course, in rapid third or first world countries like the United States, it's developed more quickly than any other place. Market forces penetrate many areas of social life and government. People don't do things. I mean, look at what's changed with COVID-19. How market forces have diminished and our social life has changed very dramatically. So one of the ways that Mead described was, and others, was what they call the looking glass self. If you don't know what a looking glass is, it's a mirror. And so they cite two studies. The Spitz study of orphanages showed that the lack of social contact and caused changes in emotional, physical health, and in some cases even the death of infants. The Haney prison study was similar, but instead of an orphanage, it was people in prison without contact from others. Prisoners in solitary confinement experience a wide variety of negative psychological symptoms. Many supermax prisons, like the one in Colorado, the rate of psychosis is in the 80 to 90% range. We need other people. Charles Horton Cooley, the famous sociologist, he and Mead talked about the development of self. And he says that this looking glass self is we develop who we are by what other people reflect back to us. So looking glasses are mirrors that give us the impression. So if, for instance, if you're told that you're funny consistently as you're growing up, that's a sense of who you become. Imagine if you're a child who hears that they're stupid all the time. How does that affect a child? So looking glass is what we develop based on other people. Looking for approval is motivational, fundamental human instinct. We all want to be accepted. And of course, positive approval contributes to our sense of self and social belongingness. Some sociologists believe that life is like a stage. That is, there's actors that come and go off the stage, as Shakespeare suggested. So Christina Neppert-Eng talked about in her study what happens when people look inside of other people's wallets or purses. And they found some interesting results. There are certain things that people are willing to show, like their driver's license, maybe a credit card, but there's things that they hold back, like a picture or a note or a stub from a play. We think differently about what aspects of our identities we're willing to show and exactly how. A sociologist named Garfinkel likened life to a stage. And we have different ways of interacting according to scripts in life. And these things can be affected by what country you're living in, and the historical moment that you're living in. Question 2, how do we make sense of the world? Well, it's usually by the context that we're involved in. People consistently and intensively take context into account. If you're working at a job, that is a master context. If you're at home, part of your family, that's also part of your context. Meaning is constructed and drawn on social context. For example, have you ever told a joke to someone who isn't fluent in English and for some reason they don't get the joke? It's because they don't understand the context that the joke's intended in. There are other methods too, including not demanding complete responses to asked questions. Sometimes this happens. Have you ever talked to someone, asked them how they're doing, and they say fine and just keep walking? Or just the opposite. Next time someone asks you how you're doing, make up a story and go on and on and see how they react to that. Most people understand the context of informal interactions. So utterances fit in a precise way into the ongoing flow of conversations with others. For example, most of the time when people ask you how you're doing, you tell them you're doing fine, but you don't overdo it. Sometimes there are simultaneous utterances, like talking with someone from another culture. If you talk to someone who's Asian, perhaps Japanese, not only do they talk, but they bow. And this gets very complicated because it's not just interactions, but it has to do with gender, especially in Asian cultures, and role differences. So if you're a student and there's an older professor, that may be a very special kind of context. And then of course, people generally take turns. This is used as safeguarding interactions. It helps save face. People get into a flow of back and forth. And we've all been in a conversation with someone who doesn't give you a chance to talk. We want to very quickly end those conversations because they're violating unwritten rules of interaction. Even emotions are specific for specific contexts. So crying, fighting, laughing, for example, happen in certain contexts. Most people don't at a wake cry, but most people don't laugh. So they can be very context driven, although that does happen. Even on stage, applause happens in predictable time segments. The actors work the audience and the audience work the actors. Appreciating performance creates a cycle of mutual reinforcement between actors and applauding audience. Imagine being on stage and no one's applauding and no one's laughing or no one's reacting. It would be very difficult. So we're often engaged in the process of managing our impression of other people, that other people get of us. And this is done in the digital age through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, etc. And we want to gain the approval of other people. Unfortunately, the communication techniques found in social media are very different than in print and electronic media. And the rules, for example, haven't been firmly established. So it makes you wonder what will happen to digital management in the next 20 years. Even interacting in public situations is different. So if you're around people that you don't know, you do what Goffman calls dimming the lights. That is, you kind of tone it down. You try not to draw attention to yourself, especially in densely populated places. Like living in cities, you try to maintain a low profile. And it often works. My parents lived in the suburb of Detroit till I graduated from high school, and they never talked to their neighbors because they just kept isolated. They weren't unfriendly people, but that's how life is in a very densely populated area. Dunninger and Moloch analyzed the interactions of people passing by on the street. Men routinely ogle women on their appearance, and in some cases actually say things. Sometimes disaffiliative gestures are made by the people that are noticed to signal the end of the interaction, or they don't want to be noticed, or they ignore the catcalls. So even in public places, people routinely have indirect interactions. If you ignore those signals, it's called interactional vandalism. So you could try this at home, see how this goes. When you're talking to one of your parents, just without warning, just turn around and walk away and see how they react. You'll need maybe a confederate to do that, someone watching. Or it doesn't have to be your parents, it could be a friend of yours. Or likewise, when someone asks you how you are, going to a long diatribe about something that's boring and not germane, and you'll get an interesting public reaction from other people. Question 3 is who matters to us? And of course, you've all seen the terms significant and generalized others. Significant others was a term coined by Mead, and those individuals are close enough to us to have a strong capacity to motivate our behavior. It's more than a spouse or a lover. It could be a friend. It could be a coach. It could be anyone who has a developmental impression on us. And then, of course, there's our reference group, the people we affiliate with, we prefer to be identified with. So it might be, for me, other psychologists or runners, because I run a lot. For you, it might be a different reference group, maybe people you work with or your family. And these all provide a sense of worth about who we are. So often it's based on things like age or tastes or interests or even the status. So there's some credence to the expression birds of a feather flock together. Generalized others are a little bit different. They don't have the same valence as significant others do. Sometimes some of these people include the social networks we're involved in. They may be overlapping reference groups. But generalized others are common sense understandings of what is appropriate and specific in time and place. So imagine if you're playing soccer and you're on a team, the coach might be a significant other, your teammates may be generalized others. You know what they're supposed to do, where they're supposed to be and how they're supposed to play, but you may not be motivated by them. And then on the other hand, you might be. Another generalized other includes the culture that you grow up in, the substance or system of beliefs and knowledge of taken for granted world together have socialized us. So imagine the culture that you live in and being raised in a different culture, like in Africa or China. There's not always boundary bound due to immigration or shifting borders, which just basically says that our cultures are changing dramatically from year to year. By 2050, the predominant minority culture in the United States will be Hispanic, and beyond that, it may actually mean that Euro white people may actually be a minority at some point in the future. How's that for a change in culture? It can also include subcultures. These are sets of individuals who share common preferences or understanding of specific aspects of the social world, but remain part of the larger group that is tied together in a more basic level. So think of maybe like Amish, who have something in common, their religious beliefs and work ethics, but they still manage to live in places in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. It's different than a counterculture who maintain similarities but run contrary to the popular culture. What challenges do we face when we move from one social context to another? Well, many of them. One of them includes the statuses that we occupy. So these are distinct social categories that have expected behaviors and roles for individuals to assume. So if you're a parent, that's a status. If you're a student, that's a status, and certain behaviors are expected out of you, or if you're a child. Different life statuses evolve with changing age and life situation. So you may not have children now, but at some point in the future you will, and your status will evolve. Each status brings different types of groups, expectations, and rule sets. Sometimes statuses collide. Role sets are specific expectations that are attached to each role. So if you're a student, one role set is to study, to be punctual, to get your assignments done. Sometimes role conflicts happen where one role intersects with another role. So it occurs when fulfilling expectations of one role interferes with meeting expectations of another. So if you do have children and you are a student, sometimes those two roles can be a problem. Severe role conflicts can cause a lot of stress. And of course, there are nonconformists or rule breakers, but most people are conformist to the groups that they and role sets that they inhabit. Labeling theory puts us firmly in certain role sets. It's basically a theory of deviance that says that once a person is labeled as a deviant and an institution or individual puts that label on, it may stick. So if you have an older brother or sister who was a troublemaker, and then when you go to school, the high school finds out that you're related to such and so, that may label you. And this is more profound in certain mental illnesses. For Sheff found that when people are labeled mentally ill in a psychiatric hospital, unless they agree to that legitimate label, whether it's legitimate or not, the doctors and nurses and institutions will continue to treat them as if they're mentally ill until they acknowledge it. Piggybacking off of Sheff's research was a guy named Rosen in Stanford who did the same type of study, but instead of having lay people, these were psychiatric workers, psychiatrists, psychiatric nurses who were admitted to hospitals professing to have psychiatric symptoms like hearing voices and not able to take care of themselves and having delusions. Once they were admitted, they didn't acknowledge any more symptoms, and yet the label persisted. They still got treated as if they were mentally ill. This finding back in the 1970s when I was in graduate school led to furthering the rate of deinstitutionalization, that is, closing psychiatric hospitals across the country. There are certain ways that you use rules. Some are explicit, some are implicit. So if you get a parking ticket, the explicit rule is you violated the time limit and you pay a fine. There are implicit rules, however. So if you're sitting at the table and you burp and your parents are sitting there, the implicit rule is that you excuse yourself. Also, if somebody gives you something, you thank them. Early on in childhood, they require interpretation, but over time, you incorporate these. These not only imply in one situation, but often apply to other situations as well. Some other include a Zimmerman study, in which in a public social welfare agency, when a child is crying, people can bend the rules and are consistent and appreciative of other people, especially if there's like a baby crying and someone's waiting in line. They'll often let them go ahead. SUD now found out that the order of care in emergency rooms do not always follow unofficial rules. So if someone's bleeding and they come in and there's a room full, they get care immediately. And people are generally okay with that. Informal rule use is important. Molach found that New York subway workers rarely reported suspicious packages, especially when they were in a hurry. Garfinkel discovered that people tend to go by the book without considering context. This is especially true in bureaucracies, where you'd think people would be wise enough to accept rule breaking, but in fact don't. And Richardson found that an example of work to rule action was based on the need to follow the rules. In his study, they discovered that a factory had a fire in it, as an example, and employees walked past the smoking machine because they wanted to be on time for a meeting. Oddly enough, the meeting was a safety meeting because in order to violate one rule, they had to, of safety, they had to violate another rule of not breaking their time, the time the meeting started. There are a bunch of conformity experiments, including Solomon Ash's study. In his study, he asked people to, in different contexts, to assess which of the three target on the stimuli on the right was the same as the lone target. And depending on the social context, people would conform if there were a number of people and even to the wrong answer. So if the group said 1, conformists, these were Confederates, by the way, conformists would also say 1. Makes you wonder what you would do in that situation. Well, if you're normal, most people would conform. Another example is Stanley Milgram's study, in which they thought they were delivering, subjects were recruited to be teachers, and as subjects experimented on. There were no subjects. Actually, the subjects were the teachers. They were trying to see how far they could push them. And they discovered that because of the lab coat, subjects would continue to deliver even painful, fatal shocks to a stranger because the authority figure told them to. And then the Zimbardo study, these three are classic studies where volunteer, not college students, but volunteer people from the community were split into guards and prisoners. These were not neither guards nor prisoners, but by taking the role on, they became sadistic. They often abused the prisoners. These were other just fellow citizens, not criminals, to the point where the study had to be terminated. We'll talk more about this later. So all this interaction business then leads us to this whole idea of an interesting topic called ethnocentrism. It essentially is a belief that my culture is better than yours. And of course, this is pervasive in American life. It's the root of nationalism, and it can be very problematic. But we'll get into ethnocentrism in the subsequent chapters.